It was a cold, dreary afternoon when Myra, a German shepherd with soft, brown eyes and a coat that once shone like the sun, found herself abandoned on the side of a lonely road. The skies had been darkening for hours, the rain falling steadily, and the wind howling in the trees. Myra had always been a beloved companion, her wagging tail the source of so many happy moments for her family. But today was different. Her owners, a family that once seemed full of love, had driven down this road before stopping abruptly. The door opened, and without so much as a glance, they let her out. The car sped off, leaving her standing in the pouring rain, confused and abandoned. Myra watched as the taillights disappeared into the distance, her ears flicking at the sound of the engine's roar fading away. She waited for a long time, hoping, wishing that they would come back. But no one did. As the rain poured harder, Myra stood frozen for a moment, her fur drenched in seconds, the once pristine coat turning dark and heavy with water. Her paws sunk into the muddy ground as she shifted uneasily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She took a few steps forward, unsure of where to go or what to do. The road was empty, and the world felt colder, lonelier than ever before. With no place left to stay, Myra started to wander. The streets were deserted, and the world around her seemed so vast, so unfamiliar. Every step was heavy, each one pushing her further from the life she had known. She walked with her head lowered, the weight of her abandonment pressing on her heart. Every time a car passed, she looked up, her eyes full of hope, but each time, her heart shattered as it passed by without a second thought. Her coat, once soft and lush, now clung to her in matted, wet strands. Her paws, too, were filthy and sore from the long walk. She had only one thought: food, shelter, safety. She searched the streets for any sign of life, her stomach growling in hunger, but there was nothing but the sound of the rain splattering against the ground. For hours, Myra wandered aimlessly. The world felt too big for her, and the rain seemed endless. She found a small patch of grass by the side of the road and lay down, curling her body in an attempt to shield herself from the cold. Her fur had long since soaked through, and now her bones felt the chill. The steady rhythm of the rain was the only thing that comforted her, the sound of nature's tears blending with her own silent grief. She closed her eyes, but sleep was a distant dream. The loneliness gnawed at her heart, a deep ache that she could not shake. She remembered the warmth of her old home, the soft voices of the children who had once played with her, and the way her owners would gently scratch behind her ears. All of that was gone now, and she was alone. It wasn't until much later that evening, as the rain continued to fall, that something caught her attention. A small piece of bread, half-soaked but still recognizable. Myra's heart leaped as she darted toward it. She had been so hungry, but just as she reached the bread, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The water level had been rising, and the small patch of land near the side of the road began to flood. Myra, desperate for the bread, didn't notice the sudden flow of water rushing in. The bread slipped further into the water, and Myra, caught in the moment of hunger and desperation, plunged after it. The current was stronger than she anticipated, and she lost her balance. In a flash, the floodwaters pulled her into a nearby drain pipe, its opening hidden in the flood of water. She fought against it, but the current was swift, and before she could do anything, she was sucked in, the darkness swallowing her whole. The smell of wet earth and sewage hit her senses as she tumbled into the pipe. Myra scrambled to find her footing, her paws sliding along the slippery, narrow walls. She barked in panic, but her voice was muffled by the relentless sound of rushing water. She could feel the cold, dark tunnel pulling her deeper, and fear surged in her chest. The water began to rise quickly, and Myra's heart raced. She barked desperately, her voice echoing through the pipe, but no one seemed to hear. She struggled to climb up the sides, her paws scraping against the wet concrete, but the water kept pushing her down. Every minute that passed, the water rose higher, threatening to drown her. Her fur, soaked and weighed down, made it harder for her to keep her footing. She tried to climb higher, but the narrow walls gave her no purchase. The sound of her frantic barks mixed with the sound of rushing water, creating a terrible, chaotic symphony of fear and confusion. Myra's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the danger she was in. If someone didn't hear her soon, she wouldn't survive. The water was up to her chest now, and panic threatened to overwhelm her. She tried to push forward, but the pipe was too narrow, and the current was too strong. Every time she thought she had a foothold, the water surged again, pushing her back down. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she desperately fought to stay above the rising water. She had to survive. She had to find a way out. But in the distance, a sound broke through the chaos. The faintest howl, a cry of desperation carried on the wind. Brian had been driving home from a long day of work. The rain was relentless, beating against his windshield, turning the streets into slick rivers. He hated driving in weather like this, but he was just a few miles from home, and all he wanted was to get there, where it was warm and dry. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him. His mind was tired, focused on nothing more than the familiar hum of his car's engine and the monotonous rhythm of the wipers. The sound of the rain hitting the roof was almost soothing, and for a moment, he thought about the dinner waiting for him at home. But then something stopped him. It was faint at first, just a barely audible sound that barely registered in his mind. He pressed on the brake, slowing down as he tried to listen. His eyes scanned the road ahead, but there was nothing unusual. He continued on, dismissing the noise as just another trick of the rain. But then, there it was again, a low, mournful howl. It was unmistakable this time. Brian's heart skipped a beat. His first thought was that it was a dog. But where could it be coming from? There were no houses in this area, just thick trees and empty fields. He looked around, trying to pinpoint the source. The howl came again, this time louder and more desperate. Without thinking, he pulled the car over to the side of the road, the tires skimming the wet pavement as he slowed to a stop. The rain pounded harder now, a constant roar that made it even harder to hear, but the cry, the faint howl of distress, still cut through the noise. His instincts kicked in. Someone or something was in trouble. Brian opened the car door, the wind and rain instantly assaulting him as he stepped out onto the roadside. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby, but the storm was making it hard to tell exactly where. He stood there for a moment, listening intently. Another howl, this one clearer, closer. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just leave, not when someone or something needed help. Brian's heart raced as he started to move towards the source of the sound. The wet grass under his boots made each step treacherous, but he pushed on, guided by that haunting cry. He had no idea what he would find, but he had to at least try. As he made his way through the field, the howl became more frantic. It was coming from beneath the ground now. Brian stopped, his breath heavy in his chest as he looked around, trying to see where the sound was emanating from. His eyes scanned the area, nothing. But then, his gaze fell upon a small, seemingly inconspicuous metal grate near the side of the road. It was barely visible under the rain-soaked grass, but he could see the faint ripples in the water around it. The howls came again, louder now, and Brian felt a chill run down his spine. He knelt beside the grate, his hands trembling slightly as he pushed aside the wet grass. The sound of the water rushing beneath the surface was deafening, but it was the desperate howling that kept him focused. He could feel the vibrations through the ground, the urgency in each cry. Without wasting another second, Brian grabbed the edge of the grate and began to pull. His hands were slick from the rain, but he didn't stop. The metal creaked and groaned as he exerted all his strength, the rusted bolts protesting against his efforts. The howls were growing louder, more insistent, as if the creature, whatever it was, knew someone was near. Finally, with one last pull, the grate gave way, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel beneath. The sight of the sewage pipe made Brian's stomach turn. But there was no time to hesitate. The howls were now so close that they nearly overwhelmed him, the sound of distress tugging at his heart. "Hold on," Brian whispered to himself, barely hearing the words above the rain. He quickly grabbed a flashlight from his car and shined it into the opening. The beam of light flickered, illuminating the wet, slippery walls of the pipe. There, near the bottom, he saw her, a soaked and terrified German shepherd, her fur matted and covered in mud, her body shaking from the cold. She was struggling to keep her head above the rising water, her eyes wide with fear. Her paws scrabbled desperately against the slippery surface, and each time she tried to climb, the water surged higher. Brian's heart clenched as he saw the poor animal's plight. She was trapped. He knew he had to act quickly. There was no time to waste. "Hey girl, it's okay," he called softly, his voice barely audible over the storm. The dog's eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a glimmer of recognition. But then, the water rose higher, and the dog's frantic struggle began anew. Brian didn't hesitate. He quickly reached into his car and grabbed a sturdy rope, tying one end around a tree nearby. Then he crawled into the muck, his shoes slipping in the wet earth, and extended his hand toward the dog. "Come on, girl, I've got you." Myra's eyes were filled with confusion, but there was a flicker of hope behind them. She cautiously moved toward him, her paws sliding along the wet surface. Brian held out his hand, urging her forward. The water was now up to her chest, and with one final desperate push, she managed to lunge toward his outstretched hand. It was a struggle, but Brian pulled with all his strength, using the rope for leverage. Myra's wet, trembling body finally made it to the edge of the pipe, and with one final effort, he lifted her out of the sewer, her paws scratching against the muddy ground as she scrambled to safety. Panting and soaked, Brian collapsed to the ground beside the dog, his heart racing from the adrenaline. He glanced down at her, soaking wet, but alive. She looked up at him with wide, grateful eyes. "It's okay now," Brian whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "You're safe." And as the rain continued to pour, Myra, exhausted and frightened but no longer alone, leaned against Brian, finding comfort in the warmth of his touch. The drive to Brian's home felt like an eternity. The rain hadn't stopped, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour. But Myra, though still trembling from her ordeal, lay quietly in the passenger seat, her head resting on the seat beside Brian. He could hear her breathing, slow but steady, as she began to relax. Brian had wrapped her in an old blanket he found in the trunk, hoping it would offer some comfort against the cold. She was soaked to the bone, her fur still matted and dirty, but he could tell she was exhausted. Despite the storm, despite the uncertainty of the moment, there was a bond forming between them. It wasn't something he could explain, just a simple understanding that she was no longer alone. Brian glanced at her from time to time as he drove. Her eyes, though tired, still held that same look of vulnerability. The poor dog had been through so much already, yet she had a resilience that struck him deep. It was as though, despite everything she had endured, she still trusted. She trusted him. That thought made Brian's heart ache. When they finally reached his home, the storm had softened slightly, though the rain still fell in thick sheets. Brian parked the car in the driveway, the headlights casting a dim glow across the yard. The house was quiet, but he knew his kids would be thrilled to meet the new arrival. As Brian got out of the car, he opened the door for Myra. She hesitated at first, unsure of what was ahead. But Brian knelt down to her level, his voice gentle. "It's okay, girl. You're safe here." She stepped out slowly, her legs shaky but strong enough to carry her. She was still cautious, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. The yard was empty, save for a few scattered toys and a bench by the garden. It was peaceful, quiet, a sharp contrast to the chaos she had just endured. Brian led her to the door, which opened before he could even knock. His two kids, Lily and Sam, stood in the doorway, eyes wide with excitement. They had heard the car pull up, and the moment they saw the wet, shivering dog, their faces lit up. "Who's that, Dad?" Lily asked, her voice full of wonder as she looked at Myra. "This is Myra," Brian replied, his voice soft but firm. "She's going to stay with us now." Myra stood there, unsure at first. The warmth from the house, the smell of dinner, the sound of children's laughter. It was all so new. Her eyes flicked nervously between Brian, the children, and the cozy interior of the home. She was still processing everything, unsure of her place in this new world. But then Lily, who was about 7, approached slowly, her hand outstretched in a gentle gesture. She had always been good with animals, and something in her eyes told Brian that she could be trusted to help Myra feel safe. "Hi, Myra," Lily said softly, her voice calm and warm. "You can come inside. We'll take care of you." Myra hesitated for a moment, her ears flattened slightly. But then, something shifted. She seemed to sense the kindness in the little girl's voice. Slowly, cautiously, Myra took a step forward, and Lily knelt down, extending her hand just a little bit closer. Lily's fingers brushed the wet fur on Myra's back, and a strange thing happened. Myra's body relaxed. She no longer seemed as nervous. In fact, it was as if she was beginning to understand. She was no longer alone. She was safe. Sam, who was a little older, watched with wide eyes, fascinated by the dog's transformation. "Can we keep her, Dad?" he asked eagerly, already pulling his jacket off to drape over Myra's shoulders. Brian smiled and nodded, his heart swelling with warmth. "Of course, we're going to take care of her. She's part of the family now." Myra stood in the doorway for a moment longer, allowing herself to feel the warmth of the house and the tenderness of the children's touch. The fear and uncertainty of the past seemed to slip away in the presence of this new, unexpected family. Myra wasn't sure if she would ever fully understand how she had gone from the dark, cold pipe to this home filled with light and love. But she knew one thing. She was finally home. The next few days were filled with adjustments. Myra was bathed and groomed by Brian and the kids. Her fur, once matted and dirty, began to shine once more as the knots were carefully untangled. She was given food, real food, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she ate without fear of it being taken away. The warmth of the house settled around her like a protective blanket. At first, Myra was hesitant. She still watched the front door closely, as if expecting someone to come take her away again. But with each passing day, that fear faded a little more. She began to settle into the routine of the house, following Brian around as he worked in the yard, sitting by the door waiting for the children to come home from school, and curling up at their feet in the evening as they watched TV. It wasn't long before Myra felt comfortable enough to explore the yard. She had a small section of the garden to call her own, where she could chase after a ball, dig in the dirt, or simply lay in the sun. Her once matted fur had begun to grow back healthy and strong, and her eyes, those beautiful brown eyes, now shone with a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. Brian noticed the change in her, too. She wasn't the same frightened dog that had emerged from the sewer pipe that rainy night. She was becoming more confident, more at ease. It was as though she had realized she was finally where she was meant to be. But the transformation wasn't just in Myra. It was in the whole family. Myra, despite her initial fear, had found a place in their hearts. She had come into their lives as a stray, an abandoned soul looking for a second chance. And in return, she had given them a gift they hadn't expected, the bond of unconditional love. One sunny afternoon, as Brian was working in the yard, he glanced over to see Myra standing at the edge, watching him intently. Her posture was different now, confident and alert. She was no longer just a dog waiting for a kind hand to help her. She was now guarding the yard, her presence a quiet, protective force that gave the family peace of mind. As she stood there, her eyes scanning the perimeter of the yard, Brian couldn't help but smile. She had found her place in the world, and so had he. Weeks passed since Myra had joined Brian and his family, and each day, the bond between them grew stronger. What had started as an act of kindness had transformed into something deeper, something that neither Brian nor Myra had expected. The house, once just a place of shelter, had become a home filled with love, laughter, and the reassuring presence of a dog who had been given a second chance at life. It was a bright Saturday morning when Brian first noticed how much Myra had changed. The sun was peeking through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the yard, and the kids were out playing in the garden. Myra, who had once been so cautious, was now bounding around with them, her tail wagging furiously as she chased after a ball. She had learned the game quickly, running after the ball, picking it up in her mouth, and returning it with an exuberance that made Brian smile every time he saw it. He stood in the doorway, watching the children and Myra play, and for the first time, he could see her true happiness. She wasn't just a rescued dog anymore. She was part of their family. Her playful bark echoed through the yard as Lily and Sam giggled, encouraging her to keep going. She had come to trust them completely. It wasn't just the kids who had softened Myra's heart. Brian had been there for her every step of the way. He had been patient with her, slowly earning her trust as he cared for her with kindness. Every morning, he would wake up early to take her for walks around the neighborhood. At first, Myra had been apprehensive, her eyes constantly darting around, alert to any movement. But now, she walked proudly beside him, her leash slack in his hand, her body relaxed as she took in the familiar sights and smells of the neighborhood. Brian found himself enjoying these quiet moments, walking with Myra by his side. It was a simple ritual that had become part of his daily routine, one he wouldn't trade for anything. He had never thought a dog could change his life so profoundly, but Myra had done just that. She had healed him in ways he hadn't expected. Later that evening, after the kids had gone inside for dinner, Brian stood in the yard watching Myra as she stood alert at the edge of the property. She was no longer the scared, confused dog who had been pulled from that sewer pipe. She was confident, strong, and protective, a quiet sentinel for the family. The soft breeze ruffled her fur as she scanned the surroundings, ever watchful. Brian chuckled to himself. "You really do take this guarding business seriously, don't you?" he said to her, his voice warm with affection. Myra turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, she seemed to understand. She gave a soft woof, as if to acknowledge his words, before returning her gaze to the yard. There was no doubt about it. Myra had found her purpose. And, in a way, Brian had too. As the days turned into months, Myra became more than just a guard dog. She became a constant source of joy and comfort. Her presence was a source of calm in the house, always there when Brian or the kids needed a cuddle or a reassuring nudge. She seemed to know when someone was feeling down, curling up beside them and offering her silent support. One chilly evening, as the family gathered in the living room for a movie night, Myra jumped up onto the couch and nestled herself next to Sam. The warmth of the fire crackling in the background made the room feel cozy and inviting, and the children, wrapped in blankets, settled in to watch the film. Myra rested her head on Sam's lap, her body curling into a contented ball. Lily reached out to stroke her fur gently. "She's really part of the family now, isn't she, Dad?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Brian smiled and nodded. "She sure is," he replied, his eyes soft with emotion. "She's not just a dog. She's family." The bond between Myra and the children was undeniable. They had learned to love her in ways they hadn't expected. Lily and Sam would often sneak her extra treats when Brian wasn't looking, and sometimes they would curl up on the floor with her, reading books or playing games together. Myra, in turn, had become more playful, more affectionate, and her once guarded demeanor had softened. She had become their protector, but she was also their companion, their friend. One afternoon, a year after Myra had come into their lives, Brian stood in the kitchen, preparing dinner while the kids played outside. He glanced out the window and saw Myra standing in the yard, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. Her ears were perked, her tail held high, a silent sentinel in the setting sun. But today, there was a calmness about her, a peace that hadn't been there before. Brian walked outside and joined her, standing beside her as they watched the world go by. The soft chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the distant sound of the children's laughter filled the air. "You did good, Myra," Brian said softly, his voice full of gratitude. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" Myra looked up at him, her eyes full of trust and affection. She stood still for a moment, as if considering his words. Then she leaned into him, resting her head on his leg. Brian reached down to scratch behind her ears, and she let out a soft sigh, her body relaxing against him. In that moment, Brian knew she had found her home, and he, too, had found something he hadn't realized he was missing: a deep, unconditional love that had transformed both their lives. Myra, once astray, abandoned and lost, had become the heart of their home. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the yard, Brian felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had both found a new beginning. They had both found a family. Together, they stood in the quiet yard, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The years rolled by, and Myra's life with Brian and his family continued to flourish. What had begun as a chance encounter, a life-or-death moment on a rainy evening, had turned into an unbreakable bond. Myra had gone from being a stray, abandoned and scared, to a loved and valued member of the family. Her transformation was not just in appearance, but in spirit, as she blossomed in a home filled with affection and warmth. She had grown into her role as the family protector with pride, but she was also a source of comfort and joy for Brian, Lily, and Sam. The neighborhood knew her as the sweet yet vigilant dog who greeted everyone with a friendly bark, but never hesitated to stand watch when danger came too close. Her senses were sharp, and her loyalty was unmatched. In the mornings, Myra would wait by the door, ears perked up, ready for her walk with Brian. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway was enough to make her tail wag in anticipation. She had become a part of his routine, and she never missed the chance to walk through the neighborhood with him, exploring the familiar paths and making sure everyone was safe. Lily and Sam had grown older, but they never stopped loving Myra. The dog had been there through all their milestones, from birthday parties to school graduations. She had sat beside Sam during his first homework project, providing an ear when he needed one, and she had comforted Lily during sleepless nights, curling up beside her and offering a steady presence when anxiety crept in. One particularly memorable day, as the family prepared for a big move, one that would take them to a new home in a nearby town, Brian stood in the backyard, watching Myra play with the kids. She had a ball in her mouth, her tail wagging as she ran back and forth, her joy evident in the way she frolicked across the freshly cut grass. Brian smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Myra had come so far from that rainy day when he had first found her. Wet, cold, and frightened. She had found her place in the world, in their world, and he knew that nothing would ever change that. She had become not only a guardian but also the beating heart of their home. It was during these quiet moments, as Myra played in the yard, that Brian reflected on how much his life had changed. Myra's presence had brought a sense of peace and balance to their family that was hard to describe. It was as though she had always been a part of their story, waiting for the right time to come into their lives. As they packed up the last few things in their old home, the house now feeling empty and unfamiliar, Brian took one final walk through the rooms. He paused for a moment in the living room, his gaze sweeping across the space. This had been their home for years, the place where they had made memories, shared laughter, and even weathered storms together. It was bittersweet, but he was excited for the future. He was ready for the new adventure that awaited them. The kids were busy outside, playing with Myra, who was chasing after one final ball in the yard. Brian watched them for a moment, a sense of calm washing over him. It was time for a new chapter. Myra had brought them so much joy, and he couldn't wait for her to continue being part of their journey in their new home. Later that afternoon, as they piled into the car with Myra in the back seat, ready to drive to their new house, Brian glanced at the dog. She sat there quietly, her head resting on her paws, eyes wide and calm. She didn't seem anxious or scared. She had always known how to read the situation. She had been through so much in her life, but now, as she lay in the back of the car, she seemed to understand that the road ahead was just another adventure. As they arrived at their new house, Brian opened the door, and Myra stepped out, her paws gently tapping against the pavement as she looked around. The new yard was large and open, a perfect place for her to explore. The house was quieter than the old one, but as Brian and the kids unpacked, Myra explored every corner of the new space, sniffing at the corners, making herself familiar with every nook and cranny. She seemed to adapt effortlessly, her resilience and adaptability shining through. Myra had come a long way, from the cold, wet night on the side of the road to this new home where she was loved beyond measure. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room of their new house, Myra curled up at Brian's feet. The children sat together, laughing about the day's events, the excitement of the move still fresh in their voices. Brian glanced down at Myra, his heart full. She had truly become a part of their family. She had brought them together, in ways they never expected. And now, as they sat in their new home, it was clear. This was where they all belonged. And so, in the warmth of their new home, Myra's journey came full circle. She had started as a lonely dog, abandoned and forgotten. But now, she was surrounded by the love of a family who would never leave her. She had found her forever home. Brian smiled as he looked around at his family, his children happily playing, and Myra resting contentedly at his feet. The storm had passed, the darkness had faded, and in its place was light, love, and the promise of many more years to come. Myra's tail thumped softly against the floor, as though she, too, knew that this was where she was meant to be. She had found not just a home, but a family who loved her for who she was, and that was all she ever needed. Together they were a family, forever.